everyone. Welcome to this interview with Krasimir Kotsev from SoCyber, a cybersecurity company from Bulgaria. Welcome, Krasi.
Hello, Iva. How are you? Thanks for the invitation, and hello to everyone.
It's a pleasure to have you, Krasi. You are specialized in a very topical issue about cybersecurity vulnerabilities, the hunting and the solving of the issue. We have seen that it's increasingly recognized as one of the key measures to improve cybersecurity in the EU regulation. We have seen the NIS2 directive focused on coordinated vulnerability disclosure, as well as the proposed EU Cyber Resilience Act, which also puts a lot of emphasis on vulnerability management. Sectorial legislation, MDR, and so on also focus on vulnerability management. What is your take on it? What would be the most significant challenges when it comes to company complying with this increasing regulation for vulnerability management?
Actually, I think all these acts and regulations are to help the companies, and they will improve the security posture of the companies. But of course, it will require some efforts from the companies and their representatives as well. Because it's not just like you have the regulation and you comply. It takes a lot of measures, it takes a lot of resources and a lot of investment from the companies to comply with those regulations. First of all, I would like to discuss actually where is the problem with vulnerability management and what's the like the key metrics, the key issues from my experience. The first one is definitely that companies lack information about vulnerability exposure, which means that companies are not aware of the vulnerabilities. They're not aware what assets they have, who is responsible for the assets, what's the criticality affecting those assets, what's the impact for the company actually. For example, from my experience, during the last 2 years, we discovered about 6,000 penetration testing related vulnerabilities, and about 100 of them were critical and exploitable, which means 24 vulnerabilities, 24 critical and exploitable vulnerabilities per company. And this is only from the penetration testing activities. But if you take, for example, the vulnerability assessment activities as well, let's have a company in the energy industry, for example, they have an average of, let's say, 3,000 IT assets. For those 3,000 IT assets, we were able to discover 62,000 vulnerabilities. So you can imagine that's a huge number of vulnerabilities that no one was aware of in the past. So in order for them to comply with the regulation, first of all, these companies, they need to know about those 60,000 vulnerabilities and they need to be able to cope with them. And also it's very important the time to remediate the vulnerabilities and the resources it takes. For example, the vulnerability takes an average of 57 days to get fixed. So you can imagine companies have vulnerabilities which are there for months and nobody even knows about it. So how can you cope with a regulation without knowing what you have? And then the second major aspect is the financial cost, of course. According to my calculations, an average company requires, with 500 employees, they require about 6 to 7 experts to cope with the cyber and information security. And this is quite a big cost for the company. Depending on the location, it might vary between 20 and 30,000 euros, which is, again, a resource that they need to dedicate. And this is information security experts, vulnerability analysts, vulnerability management experts, all of this just to make sure that they have no vulnerabilities. And then we have the compliance experts as well. So this requires a lot of resources. And then I would say the third major issue is actually that management lacks awareness. So even though companies have some awareness on technical level, the technical experts, they somehow know what's in the organization, what needs to be fixed. The management has no knowledge of this one, which means that the management will not invest in cybersecurity. As long as the tech experts can prove that this is actually required, then the management and the financial representatives in the companies will decide to eventually put more efforts. But it's about the technical people to share with the management what's important and what's to be fixed. For example, in 75% of the cases, the management was not aware about those vulnerabilities. So you can imagine you're the C-level of the company and you don't know that every single minute your assets can get exploited from a critical vulnerability, and you have no idea about it. You only care about your sales and marketing efforts and how to make some brand awareness, but you forget about the security, and it's a huge topic actually. So yeah, I think this is the biggest issues with the companies will be facing in order to be compliant with the regulations. And also, it's not only about vulnerability management. That's just a piece of the puzzle, but they also need to cope with security awareness of the employees, security policies and procedures, access management, who has access to what resources, endpoint security, network security, application development lifecycle, and so many things which are required for them to being on track with the regulations.
So what you pointed out already as an issue, the management awareness and let's say bringing to the attention of high-level management these sometimes very technical issues, regulation would normally help for that. In that sense, it's kind of the cure and also maybe also creating the problem. But you're right that there would be a lot of resources required, and these resources are not just financial, and probably it would be easy if it's only about the money. The real issue is the skills gap that we have. We are aware that there would be 1.8 million unfilled cybersecurity jobs globally. With more regulation, there would be more requirements for security professionals, and therefore we need to catch up with the skills gap. So it would be very interesting to see also policymakers, how they take into account these aspects. But we spoke about the challenges. What are the best practices? What you could share from your experience that you have seen companies do good, and then hopefully we can replicate easily and kind of make this approach across the EU?
I think there is some generic best practices which are applicable in every single industry. So I will start with those first. I think that first of all, every company needs to know their assets. It's very important, because if they know what's the important system, what's the critical resources, and where is the data, then they can eventually invest in security measures accordingly and not just spend money without knowing their assets. The second most important thing is to know where the data resides. Okay, you know the assets, but which are the ones holding the most sensitive, the most critical data, which are the ones that require solid funding to be invested. And I'm always recommending the companies to create like a logical diagram, logical data flow, which can make them aware how does the traffic flows, where does the data go from the entry points to which systems, what people have access to the data, just the life cycle of the data from start to the end until the data is stored somewhere or deleted. And this business logic, this actually logical data flow can help companies to discover business logic flows, and not only typical vulnerabilities which are discovered by the vulnerability scanners, but they can also understand about the business logic flows in their assets. The third most important thing is, I think every company needs to know what's the risk for their organization and what's the threat vector. Because you can have a company with a lot of public resources which could be exploited from the outside, or you can have a critical industry provider, like a gas provider, which can be exploited from the inside, from an internal person. So before investing in security testing, in vulnerability management, every company needs to know where is the weakest link, what's the points that they can get compromised through. And of course, another important thing is that they should know what's the difference between vulnerability scanning, IT security audit, penetration testing, because a lot of companies actually confuse the terms. They believe that vulnerability assessment is the same thing like penetration testing, and they're so different in terms of information discovered, in terms of how to implement it, how to execute the strategy. They're so different by nature. For example, when one company has publicly available assets holding sensitive data, I would definitely recommend penetration testing activities, because the vulnerability scanning might not be able to discover all the issues. We rely on, with the vulnerability scanning, you rely on signatures. And with the penetration testing, you have someone who is actually interacting with the application or the network, so they can discover so many more things, so many more issues in the infrastructure. But I would say that when the asset is not so critical, let's say, then vulnerability scanning is fine. It will do the job, and it will be so much cheaper than the penetration testing. But for example, let's be more industry specific. When we have a lot of companies with critical industry providers, operational technologies like gas and electricity providers, telecom operators, for example, with those companies, they have a lot of fragile devices in the OT part of the infrastructure. So it's not applicable for them to execute penetration testing. Neither they can do vulnerability scanning. They need to know what's applicable for them. For example, in that case, I would strongly recommend passive vulnerability scanning, which is like just sniffing the network. You intercept the traffic and you analyze some patterns in the behavior of the network traffic. This is the best approach for this kind of companies, but the approach will be very different when we talk about IoT infrastructure, like the smart cities, for example, because the devices are so cheap and they are so fragile. You cannot just go and execute vulnerability scanning, because most probably you're going to break most of them. So in that case, I would strongly recommend more efforts, more finances, more funding invested in patch management rather than vulnerability scanner, because patch management will actually help them to be on top of the security updates, and they will not have to worry about vulnerabilities anymore. So vulnerability discovery, vulnerability management is different for every single architecture. Also, some other best practices which we are always sharing with the companies. When you make vulnerability assessment, make sure this is authenticated one, because a lot of companies just run the scanner and they see some results, but they don't realize that this is like an outsider perspective with lack of visibility about the devices. So if they are not authenticated, they would barely discover about, I would say, 10 to 20% of the security issues. Also, they should make difference between web application scanning and infrastructure scanning. It's all different. Even when you have Quali Scanner, for example, or Tenable or Rapid7, every single scanner out there, they have different solutions for application scanning and infrastructure scanning, and it's all different. And when one company is approaching us with requests for vulnerability scanning, it's very often that they don't realize the difference. They think that with one single scan you're going to discover everything, which is not the case. Cloud infrastructure, it requires totally different approach. Rather than penetration testing and vulnerability assessment, we do agent-based scanning. So every single infrastructure, every single organization has a different approach. And also, when companies are doing this, they need to strictly define service level agreements. Once you discover something, how do you fix it? How fast? Who is fixing it? Like if you have critical vulnerability, what's the time frame that you need to fix this? If you have a high one but exploitable, is it with higher priority than the critical non-exploitable one? And you should know who is fixing it. You should appoint a person who is responsible to fix this from your organization, someone who knows the company, someone who knows the assets. And last but not least, I would say that vulnerability assessment teams should have a very good communication with patch management, with incident response teams. They should work in symbiotics, like one single team. They should not be separated. We do this and you do the other one. It's not about us, it's about them. You know, it's always throwing the ball, but this is not the correct approach. The correct approach is to work together, because cybersecurity can only be successful if we share with each other discoveries.
I saw so many points that we usually discuss as, let's say, the key best practices. And I'm happy to see that this is also applicable to vulnerability management. So we don't need to, again, break silos and approach different parts of security in a different way. Communication always the key, working together, sharing information. But what you also said is very, very true, there's no one solution that would fix it all. We have to be very mindful on the differences between sectors, on the difference between the objective, the business objective. What do you try to achieve with the vulnerability? Let's say management, and whether a simple scan, pen test, ethical hacking could achieve this objective best. And here you brought also the difference between the different scanning tools, but as well as testing. And I'm wondering, because most of, let's say, buzzword in security is the pen test, the ethical hacking is this exciting part of security where someone tries to break something, right? And then we see they break in, and we're like, yes, that's why we work, because it's possible. But it's not only about giving the mission, okay, do this, try to hack my tool, device, whatever the scope is. What do companies need to know when they commission or when they undertake the journey of pen test and ethical hacking?
Well, first of all, I think companies should know that pen testing is expensive, but this is for a reason. And if they believe that vulnerability assessment will do the work because it's so much cheaper, this is not the case. When you invest in penetration testing, make sure you do it for the critical assets, and then for the rest you can do vulnerability assessment, which will be slightly cheaper, and it will provide less information about vulnerabilities. But if you, let's say, decided that your approach is penetration testing and you have a lot of critical assets, then discuss internally to what extent you would like to have the penetration test. Do you want to have like a full red teaming exercise where you allow the penetration testing company to try and physically break into your building? This is so unfamiliar for Europe. It's quite famous in the United States. Do you allow them to enter the building? Do you allow them to use social engineering to eventually send some phishing emails and try to scam the employees, to use an internal employee to get access to the information? Do you want to have some information discovery, some information intelligence gathering included in the penetration testing activities? Because it can be huge and the price grows with the scope. But you might end up having only one critical web application, and then it makes sense for you to just penetration test the one single web application and maybe the corresponding API for this web application. So make sure that you know what's the scope, because it's when you hire a company, it's very often that there is a miscommunication. You want to have one thing, but then the company delivers something else, and you start blaming the company, but you didn't clarify the scope from the very beginning. So it's very important for the companies to know what they want to achieve. Also, do you allow the penetration testing company to exploit interconnected resources? Or if you have an internal pen test expert, of course, do you allow them to exploit other interconnected resources? For example, if I break into this system, am I allowed to dig deeper and then to try to exploit the inside of your organization? Or do you just limit the pen test to this very application or this very server, and then you don't allow any further compromise? This is also something very important to consider when you run penetration testing. Additionally, what's the scope of the penetration test? Because you might end up having internal infrastructure pen test, external infrastructure pen test, web application, mobile application, API penetration, wireless penetration test. So there is so many components of the penetration test depending on the customer needs. So make sure you know what's most critical for you. As I said, in the critical industry provider, the OT is the most critical aspect of the infrastructure. So you would rather have an internal penetration test rather than an external one, because everything is like a closed interconnected devices in a closed local area network. We mentioned about the social engineering, very important part. And sometimes we are explicitly asking the customers, do you want us to try and eventually get access to your systems by spoofing the emails, by trying to interact with your employees? And this is quite a sensitive topic for a lot of companies, because they're afraid from an external provider to interact with their employees. Another important thing is make sure that you verify once you discover something and you believe it's already fixed and remediated or some mitigation applied, make sure it's not discoverable anymore. Make sure this is not exploitable, because a lot of companies, they believe that, okay, we fixed, we gave this to the developer or the sysadmin, now we are safe, he will tackle this, he'll take care of it. And then 6 months later, we discovered the same issues again. So make sure that everything is fixed and eventually you verify the remediation. Also, do you allow the company to remotely penetrate your resources, or do you need them to be present on site if this is like a sensitive environment? Because this can also affect the cost. If you want them to be on premise, then this will be, of course, more expensive. Another important thing when you're actually penetrating the infrastructure, you need to know if every single access level has been tested, because a lot of companies, a lot of penetration testers, they can just try the standard user, low privileges, and they would say, okay, everything is fine. This user cannot compromise anything else. He doesn't have access to sensitive information. But did you test the moderator role, or did you test the administrative role? Did you test with root permissions, who can get where? So it's especially in web applications, you know, there is multiple access levels. So make sure you test every single one of them. Otherwise, you are just opening a door for something which was not discovered. Another important recommendation from my side is definitely provide the penetration testers with summary of the application's functionality. We can see so often companies submitting applications for testing, and then it takes for us 2 or 3 days to get to know what's the application used for, how it works, what's the logical data flow inside the application. If you share this information with the penetration tester in advance, then you're saving so much efforts. And this will reduce the cost for you. Also, it's good practice to rotate the penetration testers with the time, because one expert can only discover a certain amount of vulnerabilities, but there is something else which someone else can discover. And because every application which is written by humans can be exploited by humans, you need to make sure that at least few different people have tested this application over time to make sure that this is indeed secure. Because one pen tester is very good with the web applications, for example. Another one has bigger expertise with Android applications. So you need to make sure that you have few different angles. Also, when you provide the API, for example, when you want to have your API tested, then it's very important that you share the full API documentation and API schema with the pen testers. And don't be afraid of this one. The pen tester is like the doctor, like the lawyer. You better say everything to let them know, and they will be able to help you, rather than hiding information from them, because they will discover the information, but it will take them more time and it will be more costly for you. So I think this is something very, very important. And I would also say testing a live system can be dangerous. So if you are willing to have something tested, make sure that this is a testing environment, development environment, or some staging or some other sort of non-production environment. Because production, if you break something, the penetration tester doesn't bear the responsibility. It's the company, because they provided this asset for testing. And of course, the pen tester should make them aware that eventually they can break the application. But make sure that you test non-production systems. And last but not least, I would say make sure that you have different approach. You can test black box, you can test white box. It's very important to know what you're doing, because if you're afraid that some internet user with no access to the application can get access to your information, then black box is sufficient, and the pen testers can spend more time with black boxing. But if you want to know, if you're afraid that, let's say, an internal employee will leave the company and they'll try to exploit something, they have access to the source codes, they know how it works, they know what's the company roles and responsibilities, then make sure that you perform white box testing so that you can provide the security testers with as much information as possible.
I see. This is all very, very interesting information. I think would be really helpful for our viewers also, not only to get what they need from the security testing, but also to reduce the cost. You point out to three very interesting things. First, rotation, so diversity. There again, we have to have a very good market for cybersecurity, and I'll come back on this point after. You also mentioned the responsibility. So responsibility ultimately stays with the client, with the person owning the systems, and this is also kind of a mantra for security in general. The accountability is there. But you also mentioned about the risks. So there are risks, you said, with IoT devices that are small devices for vulnerability management that you can just break it. How can we, in terms of regulation, it's currently horizontal vulnerability management for everything. Is this, let's say, something that people should consider already in their vulnerability management policy? What should be scanned, what should not be scanned, and very well justify these exceptions?
Yes, they should definitely define this from the very beginning, but this comes with knowing the assets. So if you have an IoT infrastructure with 3,000 devices, then in advance you would know what's the important devices, which are the most fragile ones, and then you can select the ones which will undergo vulnerability scanning, and for the rest you can have something like some other agent or Windows Defender, if this is Windows devices, or some other agent that will share vulnerabilities in a non-intrusive way. You discover vulnerabilities without actually interacting with the device, without actively scanning the device. And this can also be applied. So everything can be scanned. Every single asset can be part of the vulnerability management, as long as you know which approach is the right one for you. What's the best practices for this set of devices? And definitely you should know them in the very beginning. But I think when proper patch management is applied, then to a huge extent you're eliminating the need of complex vulnerability assessment. Of course, you can have some high-level vulnerability scanning, but you don't have to interact with those devices in a very offensive way anymore.
Okay, that's, I think, also would save a lot of issues to people to have this thinking and already considering this in the level of the policy of deciding what needs to be vulnerability scanned and what not. Typically, as regulators, they think everything should and could be vulnerability scanned, but that's not always the case.
I think that they generalize vulnerability scanning, but there is so many ways to perform vulnerability discovery without active scanning. So I think the proper thing is that every device should undergo vulnerability discovery one way or another, being with vulnerability scanning, with agent-based scanning, with pen testing. You should find, so you can have like an IT audit of the security measures, of the security controls, without even touching the device, without even sending a single request to the device. So this is still vulnerability discovery, but you apply this in a slightly different manner.
I really like this because I operate in the GRC, governance risk compliance part, and this is kind of an audit approach would allow you not to discover only the technical vulnerabilities, but also process-based or human-based vulnerabilities. And last question for you, Krasi, before I let you go. We discussed there should be a market for cybersecurity services better developed in Europe, and you're one of the good success stories for European SME for cybersecurity. Even better for me as Bulgarian, you also originate from Bulgaria, you started your business there and you're also growing. Tell us a little bit about your journey, about your company, and what is the key to success?
So we started 5 years ago as a security testing company specialized in vulnerability assessment, security audits, and pen testing. But with the time, we saw a lot of issues with the vulnerability management, and we were just discovering things, but companies were not fixing them. And then we were curious, what's the reason for this? And we came to the conclusion that companies are struggling not to discover, but to manage the discovered vulnerabilities. And also the management was not aware about this one. We were only reaching to a certain technical level, but they were never sharing the report with the C-level executives. Another thing is that when we delivered they were always with different preferences about the delivery, about the reports. There was uncertain if something was tested or not. So this is why we decided to create a software solution, Kikimora, to help companies manage the discovered vulnerabilities. I would say that the key to success is to create a team of leaders. Every single person in the company, from the sysadmin to the C-level executive, they should be leaders, each one of them. Because if they are not leaders of their own life, if they're not leaders of their own activities and tasks, they would never succeed and the company will not succeed. In addition, everybody in the company is very passionate about what we're doing. They're very focused and the efforts are in one single direction. We're not spreading too much. We don't do what we can do, but we only focus on what we're best in. We provide a lot of knowledge on conferences, and this comes back as a positive feedback for us, because a lot of vendors, they just go and they present their solutions without giving any knowledge to the audience, and this is not the good approach according to me. The best approach is go and share your knowledge with the audience, and then the audience will remember you. They will come back to you with some good thoughts, and they will look after you after that. Give them that knowledge. Don't be afraid to provide knowledge to the others. Additionally, we were striving for very high quality of the service, and we're not striving for lowest prices, because some companies are trying to be cheap, but this doesn't work nowadays. You must provide high quality of services, otherwise it makes no sense, especially in security testing. If you don't invest a lot as a service provider to improve the knowledge, to have your experts knowledgeable and certified with a lot of background experience, then it makes no sense if they cannot discover the vulnerabilities. This will be not in use for the customer. Yeah, so we definitely strive for very high quality of services, and also we're trying to be very agile and to change directions when we see something is not working. We try different approach, and because the cybersecurity and in general the IT industry is so rapidly changing nowadays, you must be very adaptive and agile when it comes to changing directions. Yep, I always reply to the customers on time. This is key to success. It's one very simple measure, but nobody is doing it. We see a lot of people postponing their messages for days and weeks, and this doesn't work. You need to be there. You need to be online for the customer, and you need to be able to provide them with assistance and consultancy when they need it. They don't need it tomorrow. They need it today. Tomorrow it's going to be too late for them eventually. And also we're trying to be, from marketing and brand awareness perspective, we're trying to get more recognition by attending a lot of conferences, a lot of cybersecurity events, and also where we attend events where we can find our target audience, so that we can share our knowledge with them and tell them about the best practices in cybersecurity, so that they can learn from us. And when they learn, then they know that we are the ones that are going to be beneficial for them, to help them.
Mm-hmm. Great. I catch from you 3 words: proactive, adaptive, and very well prepared.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Krasi, for this interview. This is really, let's say, a proof that you go out and share your knowledge for free. Thank you for being our guest and for sharing this valuable knowledge with us.
Thank you, Iva. Thanks a lot.